Few people would disagree that animals have value and that they should be treated well and not suffer unnecessarily. Few people would disagree that our closest living relatives deserve special care and consideration. But who would agree that this very closeness should lead to all great apes being granted a new legal status, that they should be extended some of the same rights as humans?
This is a huge leap. For centuries, the Church has taught us humans to feel special because we're the only animals made in the image of God. Philosophers have made us think about rights in terms of the responsibilities that come with them. You can't have one without the other. And only humans, they say, can grasp that thought.
But there are precedents for shifts in the way we value other living things in relation to ourselves. Some human beings were once considered as nothing more than the property of other, more powerful humans. Women were once considered the property of their husbands or fathers. It is only in the recent past that we in the Western world have agreed to strive towards treating all humans as equals. But would a move towards re-evaluating our non-human living relatives as equals represent a move too far, or an idea whose time has come? Robin Allen's first witness, Peter Singer, is regarded by many as the father of the animal rights movement, and he is a professor of bioethics in Melbourne, Australia.
Welcome, Professor Singer. Can I ask you first how you think, philosophically, we should approach the great apes?
I think we should approach the great apes on the basis of our understanding and knowledge of what their capacities are, that is, what their intellectual and emotional lives are like. We should put aside any prejudices that we might have from the fact that they are not members of our species or that they look different from us. I think those are just as irrelevant in this situation as differences of race are irrelevant for deciding the rights of human beings.
You have spoken, I think, or written about in your book, a community of equals. What do you mean by this?
The expression a community of equals is intended to talk about the basic moral community that we recognise at present only among members of our species. That is, we recognise all human beings as having some basic rights.
Some people would, I think, say that because great apes can't be responsible for their actions in the same way that we might expect of our next-door neighbour, that they should not get the rights that we give to our next-door neighbour or to any other fellow of the human race. What do you say about that?
I don't think that rights and responsibilities are always going together. I mean, we do believe that young children have rights, 2-year-olds have rights. We believe that the intellectually disabled have rights, although we would not hold them responsible for their actions in all cases. We don't put a 2-year-old on trial for some act which may have harmed another. So I think the situation is quite the same here. We have beings who clearly are sentient beings, are self-aware beings. They may not be at the level at which we would attribute responsibility to them as we would to a mature human, but that is not a reason for denying them basic rights.
Professor Singer, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well now, Professor Singer, you of course hold a leading academic post in Australia, but it would be wrong to see you as a dweller in an ivory tower. You're a noted polemicist and indeed someone much engaged in politics.
At the moment I am engaged in politics as a candidate for the Australian Greens at our next election.
And so it would be fair to say that the message that you've put across to us on various topics down the years have been both philosophical but also political in essence.
I think if you're involved in ethics, it necessarily has a practical side. Ethics that remain purely theoretical, I think, would not be achieving its purpose. And certainly I do want to communicate to a wider public than academics. I think it's important to try and encourage, especially in a democracy, the population at large to think about ethical issues and to reflect on where they lead.
You are saying that there is one reason why these rights should be extended to the great apes, and that is because there is a community of equals. They are a part of it with us. There is a community of interest that transcends the basic thrust of historic animal welfare legislation.
That's correct. I think it goes well beyond current ideas of animal welfare. The basis is one that exists in the nature of the great apes, not in the grace and favour of human beings. And the reason we're focusing initially on the great apes is because we have so much evidence already about their capacities, their self-awareness, and we don't have quite the same sort of evidence yet about other species.
Professor Singer, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Opposing Professor Singer's view is David Mellor's witness, philosopher Dr. Michael Leahy.
Dr. Leahy, you're the senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Kent at Canterbury, and you're the author of a counterblast, I think, to Peter Singer's work entitled Against Liberation, Putting Animals in Perspective.
Yes, I think that's fair enough.
One of the, perhaps, underpinning bases of Peter Singer and his cohort's claim is that animals have a moral personality, although he seemed unwilling to accept that animals had responsibilities as well as rights. Do you believe animals have a moral personality?
No, I don't. Furthermore, to have a moral personality assumes that you have a personality. If you're actually talking about genuine personality, you're actually talking about what we would call persons. And although Peter Singer in his piece didn't actually talk about personhood, as it were, it is in fact a very, very important linchpin of his whole theory. And he argues that in fact persons are not just the great apes. He argues that most mammals are in fact persons. Pigs, dolphins, whales.
That's why in a
bears.
sense this is a bit of a Trojan horse, this argument about the apes.
Indeed it is.
What in your judgment is the ethical base for a society that rejects the community argument that Peter Singer advances?
The basis, I think, would be that if one takes the typical, as it were, human rights scenario, that human beings have the rights to live, one would argue that, as it were, lesser beings, and this would include children, the mentally disabled, and indeed animals as well. They come into the realm not so much as rights, but in terms of responsibilities and duties. Their protection comes in the sense of the duties that are, as it were, accrued by or for the adults, and that's how animals and children and the mentally disabled can in fact fit in to the whole business of human rights. But it's not that in a straightforward sense human rights apply directly to these, as it were, lesser beings.
Right.
So they fit in, as it were, indirectly.
Dr. Leahy, thank you very much.
Dr. Leahy, the debate has proceeded with a discussion about the nature of rights. I think you would agree with me that these rights that we're talking about, we've identified, first of all, as being good amongst human society.
Yes, all right.
That they help human society develop and work. They underpin our mutual respect within human society.
Yes, again.
But we don't make them special by calling them human rights, do we? We don't add anything to the debate by calling them human rights.
Well, on the contrary, I think we do. Where I think it is significant is in this respect, that human beings, the argument would be, are the only creatures who are able, in as it were a rational way, to consider their own lives, to consider the nature of their aspirations, what they want for themselves, what they want for their children. Now, if you're going to plug in, as it were, animals, then you have to argue that they either have, as it were, a peripheral membership, or else they don't qualify. But you've got to argue that animals also have these sorts of aspirations.
Dr. Leahy, do you have any difficulty with that? We're not talking about the right to marry. We're talking about the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to freedom from torture.
Yes.
Do you have any doubt that animals have that wish to be free, to be alive, and particularly these great apes, to be free from torture?
I don't think animals wish at all.
Nevertheless, if these rights are good for us, and they could be good for these animals, the great apes in particular, is it not hypocritical to refuse to extend them to them?
Well, there are various reasons for supposing that it wouldn't be hypocritical, but that it might be disastrous if, particularly, the next step would be, even if you did allow them to the great apes, the next step would be that they would have to be allowed, so the agitation would go, for the other mammals, whales, dolphins, and whatever. This certainly is Peter Singer's argument.
So you're frightened about where it'll lead?
I'm not exactly frightened about it, but...
Isn't that what comes over, that you're frightened about where it'll lead, that you accept David Mellor's argument that this is some sort of frightening Trojan horse?
I would be frightened to some extent for Western civilization. I'm not sure I'd be frightened myself, but I think the implications would be really quite catastrophic. I mean, you'd have cows everywhere. You wouldn't be able to, you wouldn't be able to kill them, and so you can just see some of the implications.
We'd have to work out some practicalities.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying.
In India, they know the practicalities of cows everywhere, don't they?
That's right, yes.
What I'm concerned about is that these questions that you ask were exactly the questions that were asked by our predecessors when they met the Red Indians in the New World. But in times gone by, it was used as the foundation for the treatment that they received, or indeed that Africans received when they were enslaved. It was because they were at some lesser order of being. You'll accept that. I can see you're nodding.
I'm just nodding because I'm understanding what you're saying, but I don't agree with it, because I would have thought that any person would not confuse, even 150 years ago, or 250 years ago, would not confuse a Red Indian with a gorilla. I was suggesting to you earlier that, in fact, human beings were the only creatures who were able to consider their existence in a controlled way. And the various human rights that there are cater to this.
But if this is the hallmark for the right to these rights, if this is the touchstone for that, that would exclude many people of the human race.
Such as?
Those that perhaps are in a coma, or are suffering from a stroke, or the newborn,
they might
or those who are seriously mentally defective, but yet they must be ascribed rights as well. Do you admit these people to our community of equals, entitled to these rights?
Yes, you admit them, as it were, to a degree. You don't admit them, for instance, such that they can get married. I mean, they're not full members, shall we say, of the moral club.
Not full members
Not
of the
full
moral
members
club.
of the moral club, no. They're associate members.
Well, perhaps the apes, too, could be associate members.
They could be waiting in the wings, perhaps, but not yet. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Right, thank you.
Well, members of the jury, the issue remains very much as was set out at the beginning. Manifestly, any civilized society profoundly fails in its duty if it fails to offer protection to all animals, but notably to these animals that we know are genetically the nearest to us. And that is not the issue that you have to address. That is taken as given. The issue could not have been put with greater clarity by Professor Singer. He postulates the community of equals, and the admission to the community of equals is based on proof of capacity. Proof of capacity that entitles a rational person to say that these great apes manifest characteristics, emotions, quality of thought, moral sense, that whilst not making them precisely the same as mankind, permits them to be drawn within the curtilage of the human race. I say to you that, fascinating though a lot of that evidence has been, what you haven't had is evidence that takes the great apes out of the animal kingdom and into a kinship with human beings that would entitle us to move their legal protection away from a traditional animal welfare view into the community of equals, which entitles them to some partnership with us in human rights legislation. And so I conclude by saying the only purpose of this debate is that we bring intellectual rigor to bear. We all of us get sentimental about animals, particularly animals that in so many respects give a hint to us of what maybe once we were. But the fact is we are no longer like that. We must treat them kindly and humanely. We must value them for what they are. But what they are is apes, not human beings or anything like it. And that seems to me to be the basis you should make your decision tonight.
In my closing submission, I shall not ask you to give rights, but merely to move this debate on. When we started looking at this issue tonight, we probably all brought our own preconceptions, limited by our knowledge of our own humanity and the differences that we see between us and the apes when we go to the zoo. But when we explore those limits, we can see that there is much, much more to know and to understand about their affinity than about their differences. When you reflect on that, as you will do in a minute or two, the question you should ask in this debate is whether this issue, this claim that they should have the right to life, liberty, and freedom from torture should be stopped here and now, or whether it is a debate that should go on and perhaps lead to real action outside of this studio. My witnesses have said that the great apes should be admitted to a community of equals, and they mean a community of equals in this sense, that they have an equal right to life, an equal right to liberty, and an equal right to freedom from torture. How those rights will work out in practice when they come into conflict is not the issue before you. That is the issue that would emerge in some individual specific case. We are talking here about general but very important principles. I want to finish with one short point. Whenever our human race has looked at the extension of fundamental rights to any corner of humanity, fear of the consequences has always emerged as the prime argument for not going down that line of inquiry. But I think you will agree that the debate has shown that these fears are truly groundless. I ask you to move this debate on.
So can we start with the relevance of their genetic makeup?
On the genetic point, is it not irrelevant as to precisely how close they are? We know they're very close. We were told 98% in some ways, and then we were told, well, we're close to lots of other things as well. The fact is that beyond dispute, they are our closest relatives, aren't they? That's the first thing.
It's such a crucial issue to this that it wasn't, to my mind, completely proved that we're close enough to accord rights. The genetic question, it's such an issue for me that I have to move on to other areas before I can come to a decision.
Parallel. Yeah, yes, but when we were talking about the 98% similarity of our DNA, he then went on to say, Roger Dunbar, that 90%, I mean, that we have 90% in common with a dog. And I mean, then you see what kind of a scale we're talking about.
In this particular section, you're actually talking about superiority of intelligence, aren't you?
Yes, that's right.
And I think that in the summing up, you should really set out once again what the evidence was.
Well,
and we heard from Professor Singer that these animals were more intelligent than others because they were able to solve problems, because they were conscious of time, because they were able to plan for the future, because they were aware of themselves, and also because they had, in his view, the intelligence of a child between 2 and 3 years of age.
Yes. But wait a minute, because I really was worried about Peter Singer's list of attributes, because he had no direct knowledge of these animals.
May I interject a rather strange and queasy point of view about this, all of this evidence, exactly the point you've just made, Mary, which is the evidence of the people who are in close contact with animals is not to be trusted in case they're emotionally corrupted by the experience. And the evidence of people who are completely removed from the animals, but surely the people who are completely removed and denatured from their experience of animals are also in a somewhat fallacious worldview.
Well, certainly we had a great deal of evidence about their communication skills, about their social cohesion, about their ability even to be altruistic in certain cases. But all of this was then very carefully toppled by Dr. Hayes, who talked about this being a behavioral examination or observation that could not hope to enter the ape's way of thinking.
Could we just move to this other thing about language? The ability to learn our own language seems to me in irrelevance, because somebody said, why on earth should they?
But what about the statement of Sue Savage-Rumbaugh when she talked of good, bad and quiet? The ability to understand good, bad and quiet.
No, there was no evidence
That's quite
given.
dramatic evidence.
Yeah, but no, wait a second, but there was no evidence given. This was a statement. This was a statement.
Based on many years of working in the field.
Yes, I wanted to hear some evidence about their being able to distinguish between good and bad.
I personally am not persuaded by that argument. I didn't think we got any evidence of that.
I think, Mary, that you're underestimating to what extent these people have researched in this area in some detail and convinced themselves. They were absolutely convinced that there was a basis of communication.
I think that
and we're sort of writing it off. I think that's being quite a little...
And we're writing it off. Can I just say about Dr. Leahy, I thought he started off quite well actually in countermanding that, but I think he actually sowed the seeds of his own contradiction by dealing with the Amerindians, because of course he and I think David Mellor fell into that trap, because that is the one thing where the Spanish authorities, the Catholic Church at the time, debated the subject much more fully than we're debating it, and actually decided that they were not human beings and that they did not have souls, and therefore it was acceptable to kill them.
To base our whole argument today on the mistakes made by the Catholic Church during their darkest period of the Inquisition, 5 centuries ago, a little bit now.
I really don't believe there's much mileage in the argument that we've refused entry to the equality to one gender or one race or another race before, and therefore we must avoid that by letting in a different species.
Once you enshrine this right in whatever convention it is, whether it be international convention or domestic law, you actually push people into taking decisions which are, as David Mellor was talking about, are about welfare. And it might be that those who are pushing this whole agenda see this as a way of driving on the welfare argument in a way where at the moment it is simply being ignored.
In the summing up that the QCO, Robin Allen, made in favour of, he said he made quite a restricted claim, which was just a desire that our decision keep the debate open.
Quite so.
You see, and
I regarded that as an absolute lifeline.
Well, it has been a fascinating and difficult debate. I certainly don't envy the jury their task. But the jury has considered all the evidence, weighed up both sides of the argument, and must now decide, should the law be changed to give great apes some of the same legal rights as humans?
Now, can I ask you each to tell me which way you're going to come down on that?
Yes, well, I suspect that we took the rights away from them in the first place, and I personally don't have any difficulty with admitting them to a community of equals, but I certainly have no difficulty in granting or re-awarding the basic legal rights?
I'm uneasy with the notion of the community of equals. I'm not convinced by the arguments about language or cognitive ability. However, I do believe that this issue relates in interesting and complex ways to our views of our own humanity, and on the basis that I believe that it will influence very importantly welfare decisions both for humans and for the great ape species, I have no real difficulty in supporting the proposition.
I have great difficulty in supporting the proposition. I feel very strongly that in order to be accorded the passport to human rights and to this community of equals, what we should have is another being with the same moral worth, the same capacity for moral distinction that humans have, and that therefore, although protection of this endangered species ought to be enshrined in the law, certainly we should not accord them any kind of human rights.
I think that we've got to take this whole agenda forward, and I have no problem at all in accepting the principles of right to life, right to liberty, and freedom from torture, and I think that will be the general view of people outside as well.
Yeah, I think it depends on what we gain and what we lose. I think despite my doubts about my pragmatic doubts about the fact that the great apes' habitats seem to coincide exactly with parts of the world where human rights are the most under threat. On balance, I think that possibly we will move both of them forward by agreeing that we give them some of these rights that we hope to enjoy ourselves.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've had an extremely interesting and quite difficult discussion as members of the jury, and we went over the evidence as far as we could. And we have listened very carefully all day to, I think, everything that's been said, I hope so, with equal attention. We have not been able to reach a unanimous conclusion. But with one dissenting voice, we have concluded that we believe that the law should be changed to give to our closest living relatives some of the same rights, basic rights, enjoyed by humans. That is the right to life within limits, the right to liberty within certain limits, and the right to freedom from cruelty or torture. What moved us really was that all of this evidence together, from all of the people who'd studied the great apes, either in the field or in the laboratory, all of this evidence made us feel very strongly and believe and hold most strongly that these animals were of peculiar value, and it was our human duty to accord, as far as we possibly can, this value to the survival of these really amazing animals. And so to end with, I just wish to thank all the witnesses for giving us the material out of which we came to this conclusion. Thank you very much.